Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. To kick things off for today's event, please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Mangino, President of Queensborough Community College.
Welcome, everyone, to a conversation with the author and artist of John Lewis's March. This is the second year of the Welcome Read and the second presentation by Nate Powell, now joined by Andrew Aydin. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to meet with the creative team behind such an inspiring series and appreciate the support of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. In March Book 2, John Lewis has transferred to Fisk University and deepened his commitment to the civil rights movement and peaceful protests. In our QCC classroom, students and faculty are having rich discussions of identity and dedication. How do you identify with John Lewis's steadfast vision and action in March Book 2? What is your passion? What issues and injustices compel you to get into good trouble? I've really appreciated those students who have posted to Instagram and TikTok using the hashtag WRQCC 2022. You've made our campus look fabulous. I really have enjoyed watching the videos. I was sad to see that this was going to be on Zoom rather than in person, but then I realized it really gives us the opportunity to see inside the artist's actual workspace. So I hope you appreciate the conversation and viewing that. So again, welcome to Nate and Andrew to give us deeper insight and inspiration into John Lewis and their process of creating the graphic memoir series, March.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mangino. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocity and genocide. These horrors continue to have ongoing psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Now, to kick things off, I'd like to introduce this year's Welcome Read coordinators, Beth Cunahan, Dr. Sybil White, and Dr. Ilse Schreinemakers. Moderating today's event is Dr. Schreinemakers, who is an associate professor in the English department at Queensborough Community College, where she serves as deputy chair and primarily teaches first-year composition courses. She's also one of this year's KHC National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium faculty lead. Dr. Schreinemakers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. It's my pleasure to introduce to QCC faculty and students the creative team, Nate and Andrew, who, along with Congressman John, developed the award-winning March series, the first comic to win the National Book Award. Andrew is an Atlanta native who grew up reading comic books and after college took a job with Congressman Lewis, who mentioned to him in 2008 how the 1957 comic book, Martin Luther King and Montgomery Story, played a role in the early days of the civil rights movement. Andrew recognized the potential for a comic on Congressman Lewis's life to inspire young people. And with Andrew's urging, Lewis agreed as long as Andrew wrote it with him. Collaborating with Nate, the March trilogy was born in 2013. So now I'll introduce Nate, who started self-publishing at the age of 14. His extensive body of work, in addition to March, includes the books Come Again, You Don't Say, Any Empire, Swallow Me Whole, The Silence of Our Friends, The Year of the Beasts, and Rick Riordan's The Lost Hero.
The classroom.
Powell is the first cartoonist ever to win the National Book Award. And before we get to meet our fabulous panelists, I just would like to share a quick anecdote. Last week, one of my students enthusiastically shared with me, "Miss, I read this book every day on my bus ride to work until I finished it. The book you got me reading." So without further ado, Nate and Andrew.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's good to be with you. It's always moving to be able to be with schools that are reading this together, because I think it's so important that we have a conversation about what's in the book and how it came about, and its very existence in some ways was an act of nonviolent civil disobedience. My name's Andrew Aydin. I grew up in Atlanta. The congressman was my congressman since I was 3 years old. My father was a Turkish Muslim immigrant, and I was raised by a single mother. And I grew up reading comics because it was a place where I could read stories about people trying to do the right thing because it was the right thing to do. And I think that's in large part why I gravitated towards it. And so as I got older, my mother raising me by herself made me very cognizant of the pernicious violence of discrimination. My mother, being a single mother in the 80s, this was a period of time where a woman could largely not get a loan without her husband's signature, or even it had been less than a decade since she could get her own checking account. And it influenced my politics. It influenced everything about what I wanted to do. And so I was very fortunate. I managed to go to college. I got a scholarship. I went to school not too far from you guys in Hartford. And I worked in politics first as the floor assistant to lieutenant governor. I started the day after I graduated. It was funny. My mother actually showed up to my first day at work with my grandmother, just like knocked on the door. I think she just wanted to know if I was really employed, but there she was in the state capitol in this beautiful building. And then I went, and when his term was up, I went and did veterans casework for a congressman in Connecticut at the height of the Iraq War. And it was brutal, the emotional toll, both for me and the people that I was trying to help, seeing that they had been sent to war without the resources they need and brought home and were not receiving the care that they need. It was incredibly difficult. And so at the same time, my mother was starting to get sick, and I knew I needed to move closer to her. So I applied for a job in Congressman Lewis's office, answering his mail. And I'll never forget going down to interview with him. And in this process, I learned that the mail was incredibly important to John Lewis because he wrote his letter to Dr. King. That's how he became a part of the movement. And so answering his mail in this congressional office was this sacred responsibility where any letter or any note could be from another young person who could be, in the congressman's eyes, the next young person like him. And so I interviewed, and I told him, what it was like, growing up in Atlanta in the 80s. We ended up having this whole conversation about a period of time in Atlanta that people have forgotten, before the Olympics, before the city was rebuilt, before it became such a business hub. It was a different time. It was a different place. And it was my own existence in between the two communities with a Turkish father that I didn't understand. I ended up in my childhood spending a lot of time in the Black community and immigrant communities. And it gave us a real foundation for a relationship. And so I'll never forget at the end of that interview, he asked if I had any questions. I said, no, sir, but I want to tell you, my mother, every time I interviewed with another politician, because I'd worked for two before you, she said, oh, that's nice, but I've never heard of him. But when I told her I was interviewing for a job with you, she got very excited, and she said, oh, he's a good one. And then the congressman turned, and he got that grin that you see in his mugshot, that little sly grin where his face starts to break a little bit. He said, well, you call your mother and you tell her you got the job. And that was where it all started for me. And so I started in the congressman's office in 2007, answering his mail. And, it was not glamorous. It was a desk that was just piled 3-4 feet high with letters that had stacked up before I started. And I learned to write in the congressman's voice. It was something that I think about often, about why that was a skill that I had. And I think being on a scholarship most of my life, being in communities where I felt almost perpetually like an outsider, I learned a code switch. You would bring a different voice to each occasion. Sometimes you'd have the Southern drawl. When you go to school in Connecticut, you definitely do not bring out your Southern drawl, and you learn to suppress it. And so then when it came to learning someone else's voice, it was just another voice to learn. And the congressman was so specific, right? I mean, this is a Black man who grew up in the 40s in Alabama. He had such a unique way of speaking. It was there were no wasted words, right? He was so specific and deliberate in each word that he chose. And so when I did that for almost a year, and the congressman got a primary challenge, and he hadn't had a reelection campaign in more than a decade. And the congressman and I had gotten to be very close, so he asked if I would come down to Atlanta and serve as the press secretary on his reelection campaign. And I did, and that's really the first time, even though I grew up in Atlanta. I went to Atlanta Public Schools. They took us to the King Center every, year or two, and they would tell us the story. What I saw is the story of gods and kings, Martin Luther King versus LBJ or JFK. But I never heard the story of the young people, of what the people in SNCC were capable of doing, of how they pushed for some of the most radical reforms that we take for granted today. And it was on that campaign that we also faced this central question of, like, how do we teach young people about what John Lewis did? The memory of the movement had been so condensed, and the role of John Lewis had been forgotten. They saw it largely as he went to Selma. He protested, he was beaten, and that was it. And what have you done for me lately? And they didn't understand not just the breadth and depth of John Lewis's contribution, but the breadth and depth of the young people's contribution. And it had been forgotten. And so as I sat there on that campaign, going with him from event to event, writing speeches and press releases and ads and whatever else he asked for, I heard these stories for the first time of young people and the power that they had at 17, 18, 19 years old, standing up to the status quo, standing up to the people who represented oppression. And I remember it was like a light bulb went off to me, like understanding for the first time the true measure of John Lewis's contribution to not just the civil rights movement, but American society. And so as I came down to the end of the campaign, we were having more of these meetings. What can John Lewis do? And it was almost, time for it was almost election day. And we started having a conversation about whatever I was going to do after the campaign was over. And I said, I'm going to Dragon Con, which, if you've ever heard, was a big comic convention in Atlanta. And everybody laughed at me. And the congressman pipes up from the back and he says, "Don't laugh. There was a comic book during the movement. And it was deeply influential. And that was Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. It was the first time I'd ever heard of it. And I went home that night and I looked it up on the internet. It was beautiful. It was 16 pages cover to cover, a 1950s studio house style, an introduction to Rosa Parks and Gandhi and nonviolent civil disobedience and Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycotts. And I remember sitting there thinking that night, with all these questions swirling around in my head about how do we teach John Lewis's story, and reading that comic and my own love of comics that I had held my whole life, and just thinking, why isn't there a John Lewis comic book? So I went back to work the next day and we had another one of those meetings to discuss what else we could be doing. And I remember I suggested, I think John Lewis should write a comic book. And the congressman later said in an interview, they asked him, "What did you think when the young man first suggested that?" And he said, "I thought that boy had lost his mind." But I couldn't give up on the idea. It was too much. It's made too much sense. And so I kept asking. Finally, one day we were campaigning just before the election was over off Wallace Road in Southwest Atlanta, near the congressman's old house. And there was a flash of lightning. And before the thunder could roll, John Lewis had taken off at a full sprint back to his car. And there's only two things John Lewis was ever afraid of: thunderstorms and snakes. And that's because both of them can kill you in rural Alabama. And so there John Lewis was at 68 years of age at a full sprint running back to his car. We're trying to catch up. We got our yard signs, a little hammer, and we were knocking them in, and we get into the car just as the rain starts to come down. And there's like 6 of us in a 5-seater, all jammed into this car. John Lewis is in the front passenger seat. And I remember one of the interns said, "You should ask him again about that comic book. He can't go anywhere." And so I did. And the congressman got that look, that same look that he had the first day he told me I had a job. That little smile on his face. And he turned back and he looked at me. And he said, "Okay, I'll do it, but only if you write it with me." And that moment changed my life. Now, we went on for years, we worked on it. Most publishers didn't understand the idea. We got rejected quite a bit. And it was difficult. I mean, for a long while there, it was just me and John Lewis and an idea. But finally, we were able to pitch a publisher over the table. He asked me to write as much script as I could. And I think about this a lot because keep these sort of friends in your life. I remember he said, take a month, write as much as you can, send it to me. We'll see if your script's any good. And I went home to my friend's house where I was staying because we were in New York with this pitch. And he said, I get home, I tell my buddy about it. I'm like, we got to celebrate. And I said, no. My friend says, no, you need to sit down and write. And I sat down that night and he sat with me and together we worked. And by the end of it, I had cranked out 10 pages and almost to the page that became the first 10 pages of March Book 1. So remember those people in your life, keep them around you because they will be the ones who push you and make sure that you're able to achieve or do the work that you have to do when you have a good idea, because a good idea is one thing. It's the level of work and effort that you bring to it that is the difference. And so we worked then on this book for almost 2.5 years. Nate comes on board. Nate's got he just had his first baby. And, he comes to visit us, comes to the Capitol. We're hanging out. I think, Nate can say more about this, but, this was back in the day before the Capitol was as closed off as it was. As after everything happened on January 6th, they closed it all down. So we were able to walk Nate through all of these places that you see in the book, that the framing device, the inauguration of Barack Obama shows you. And we worked on this book and we worked on this book. And lo and behold, book 1 debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I'll never forget when John Lewis was told that. We were in the office. I put the phone on speaker. The publisher said, congratulations. And the congressman started to cry. And he grabbed me and he hugged me and he had a full face of makeup on because he'd done an interview on television just a few minutes before. And with his tears running down his face, they loosened up the makeup and I got a big John Lewis face impression just right on my chest. And when he pulled back, he was so embarrassed. He said, I'll get you another shirt. I said, sir, we hit #1 on the New York Times. I don't need a shirt. I can wash this. But I think about how much that meant to him. This was somebody who'd worked his whole life. He'd written multiple books. He'd never been on the New York Times bestseller list. But here you come along with this idea that most people didn't understand and that he embraced because he was perpetually able to reinvent himself. And it worked. And so we're here to talk about book 2. And that was, I think, Nate and I will both say, where we really hit our stride. It was an incredibly important book because you've got to understand the reason we divided it the way we did is because each one of the chapters in the various books are meant to be pushed together so that you understand a larger point. For instance, in book 2, you have to have the Freedom Rides together with the March on Washington because you have to understand that the March on Washington would not have been possible without the Freedom Rides. It is about the building and the escalation, the movement building that occurs. You could not have brought hundreds of thousands of Black and white people to Washington if you hadn't integrated the interstate busways. There would have been no way to get them there. And so you see those lessons as they come together. And then to end it with the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, we always think of the March on Washington as a high watermark, and we leave out the inevitable violent pushback. And so one of the things that we were able to do in March that I think, really separates us all, that separates these books from attempts beforehand, is that we were able to use primary documents to bring you into the moment. And there's 2 examples I'll mention. One is that when you look at that scene during the Freedom Rides, when Dr. King is in the basement of the church and it's under siege, and he's calling for the National Guard to be brought in to protect him, and there's a phone conversation with Robert Kennedy. That was actually based on transcripts. That is their exact conversation that we were able to get from the Justice Department archives. And unfortunately, during the previous administration, those documents were taken off of the Justice Department's website. And so now one of the only places you can see that conversation word for word is in March Book 2. And it talks about it's an example of the living history, the living importance of research and using primary documents to tell your story. And in other cases, we had to correct the historical record. In John Lewis's own book, Walking with the Wind, they misidentified the 13 original Freedom Riders. And so we had to set that straight in March. It was so eye-opening to me to be able to read all these different accounts of the movement from different writers and realize that many of them don't agree. And that's why it's so important for you as students to understand the necessity of doing primary document research. That's how you get to the truth. You can't take everything at face value, even any account, and you have to verify. That was just something the congressman actually really loved about this process, because we were bringing these documents, we would show him the photos, and you could see in his eyes as he went back in time to that moment and relived it. And so I encourage you all to take these lessons. You were young, but you also see the future. John Lewis doing March never would have happened if he hadn't listened to that young person who was 23, 24 years old. You're not that much younger than that. You're going to have these ideas. You're going to see the future, and they're going to be ideas that you understand that other people don't. Just if my colleagues laughed at me when I first proposed this, even John Lewis thought I was out of my mind. There are things that you see that will work in ways that you can't even possibly imagine, but that you understand because the future is something that you have determined, because you will build it. So with that, I want to turn this over to my really good friend, my longtime collaborator, my brother, Nate Powell, who I've been so grateful to be on this journey with. Nate?
You bet. Hey, y'all. How's it going? Thank you, Andrew. And yes, what a journey it has been. I'm Nate. Glad to be back for those of y'all who were around last year for our discussion. Yes, it really jumping right into both the creative and editorial approaches for March Book 2 and how those relate to March Book 1 and the whole path of our work together. Comics are always weird, like graphic novels, graphic nonfiction, book-length comics take forever to make. And sometimes, it's like, it's really jarring how quickly they can be read or consumed. And so along the way, like our 4.5 years of collaborating together as a team with Congressman Lewis and with our editor Lee on these books, were punctuated, by these breaks that became more and more regular, involving travel and speaking together, and then gaining new information, sometimes in real time, and then going back to our respective homes to continue working. I guess for Andrew and I, we perceive March Book 1 as being a very different thing in terms of creative and editorial process than March Books 2 and 3. One way is simply the fact that March Book 1 is where Andrew and I learned to work together, how to play to each of our strengths, how to look out for each other's weaknesses, how to actually make everything function together. We were able to apply that with March Book 2, and thankfully having like a little bit of a break of a couple of months in between these, we were able to reassess a lot of stuff. That is inseparable from the unique position that March is in, by which it is both history and memoir. The fact that we work together to show an objective account of history and of a people's social movement that is through the eyes and in the words of someone helping lead it from its center, but that also makes allowances for and embraces the fact that so much of this is John Lewis's subjective experiences, both from his memory and from those of the people around him. And so for Andrew in particular, a lot of his work centered around finding this cohesive space to bounce back and forth between subjective and objective accounts of history, and learning how much space to make and in which places for a more objective historical information to prop up John Lewis's subjective accounts. Also the fact that, our co-writer and collaborator, the man himself, was a primary source for so many of the experiences we covered. I guess our two major themes, which would have happened in March Book 2, are also tied into this shift. I guess we lucked out working on March Book 1 in that, in terms of balancing that subjective and objective viewpoint and experience, so much of the content within March Book 1 is limited to John Lewis's first-person experiences as a kid and as a teenager growing up in Alabama or leaving to go to college in Nashville. And once we get into these early moments with the sit-in movement, particularly in downtown Nashville, there's an expansion into media documentation of these early struggles and these early activist campaigns, but notably the media presence and coverage is very limited at the time. Creatively, this actually gave us a little bit of leeway as storytellers in comics to be able to follow and see through John Lewis's subjective accounts of some of the action in the streets, on the scene, in the stores, and to be able to lean into that subjective account. But the story of the civil rights movement is also the story of the mediation of that movement, the increasing documentation in mass media, the relationship of the free press to the civil rights movement, and the fact that that expanded coverage allowed the relatively modest gains of the first few years of the civil rights movement to get into enough living rooms and enough homes and enough community conversations across America that it was actually able to reach a critical mass, that it was actually able to push otherwise comfortable, uninvolved white people across America to challenge their conscience, to expand their awareness. And really a lot of that had to do with the growing presence of media to document this movement. That is very present in March Book 2. And I think that's the largest shift in content, is recognizing that journalists and camera people and reporters themselves become a meta character of sorts. And so here we have, after the sit-in movement, as we were opening March Book 2, the stand-in movement, which simply shifted tactics to desegregate area movie theaters, et cetera. Not only like this scene, I feel like tackles the two main themes which differentiate March Book 2 from March Book 1. The increased presence of the media as a meta character of its own, and recognizing the more regular appearance of journalists, both local and national, to document what is happening on the streets, but also to highlight the fact that after these relatively modest gains in legal protections and civil rights and assurances from the sit-in movement, the disproportionate backlash from the white supremacist establishment and from racist members of the public in general, both in violence and in legislation, and to highlight the disproportionate nature of that backlash relative to those modest gains. That became the central focus. And it's important to note that, like, at the drawing table, at least, these may be things that I have read about and have known along the way, but it's not until I'm sitting down to really put it on the page that a lot of those connections become real for me. And it's in roughing it out and beginning to draw that I recognize where certain visual themes need to be pushed, even if I see and understand them in the script or in our reference and research material. This is where, as a visual storyteller, I recognize that I have that part of my job is to push the visibility of some of those themes in the pages of the comics. Okay, also with this mix of memoir and history, throughout March, a lot of this, when striking that balance, is to recognize where there may be room within the story and within the script to push the subjective sensory experience of John Lewis, but also of many other characters and real life people involved within the story of the civil rights movement. And a lot of those things were just sort of naturally what I was looking for within these moments of action and moments of reflection throughout the March trilogy. But even in the very first full scene of March Book 2, we're really jumping right into the action here. And as we're getting into the expanded sit-in movement, moving from lunch counters to fast food joints throughout Nashville, I was very lucky that we actually had a speaking engagement in Nashville in early October of 2013, the week before I started drawing Book 2. And so I actually visited the public library, which is above what was the Crystal Burger. And I was able to see the facade and see the lay of the land and where this Crystal Burger rested in downtown Nashville, and was able to go home and immediately draw from my own subjective experiences of the space. Moving into young John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette. Oh no, is it Jim Bevel who went with him? No, I think it was Bernard. Going to take over for other activists who had been attacked and kind of frozen out with air conditioners and water and soap from their sit-in shift, recognizing that at this point, when young John Lewis is the subject of an attempted murder, an explicit attempted murder by the manager of this Crystal Burger, but watching with very minimal voiceover caption, watching the manager telling other workers to go home, turning on a fumigator filled with insecticide, locking all the doors and turning out all the lights, leaving John Lewis to die. It is in these moments that it was necessary, in order to connect with the humanity of the historical people involved, but to recognize that these are the best opportunities to pose that moral and existential challenge to the perpetrators of white supremacy and to the perpetrators of this violence. So John Lewis's voiceover here, when reflecting upon it, was that the fumigator was used only for killing pests. And as they're praying together for protection, as they assume they are dying, at first, I didn't believe that man could have really left us there to die. Were we not human to him? And this is where, in terms of the historical information we were working with, and from John Lewis's memories, we had all of these components which very plainly spell out the action of premeditated attempted murder here. But I feel like it is the moral challenge that comes from John Lewis's reflection, from those questions posed back, questions he didn't get a chance to ask directly to his attempted murderer. Therein lay the power, I think, and a lot of the shift that we had in March Book 2. Now, also speaking of moving around through the sensory experiences of sights, sounds, textures, as I was mentioning, the benefits of being able to visit a lot of these sites and bring my own experiences back to the drawing table. I also grew up from kindergarten through 4th grade in Montgomery, Alabama. And not only does that come with a lot of it made a lot of the reintroduction and revitalization of this history very personal to me, being raised by well-intended baby boomer white Southerners who had their own baggage about learning and mislearning the history of the civil rights movement around them as kids and as teenagers. But the fact that so much of my young miseducation about the movement was really focused on disconnecting any continuity between the happenings of the movement and the world that I was growing up into the 1980s. And so a lot of the locations, particularly in March Book 2, I was physically very familiar with. I had visited virtually every site in Alabama as a kid, both with my family and with my school. And I had enough familiarity, not only of downtown Montgomery and Birmingham, and the way that streets were constructed, the way that buildings looked, but also the ways in which dirt, soil, plant life, the way that all of this interacted with the environment, the way that space operated. And so whenever possible, I recognize that even though my job is to fall into telling John Lewis's story through his eyes and in his words, it was also my responsibility to strengthen that account by embracing the fact that I had my own memories I could inject into the visuals. And that's something I was hesitant to embrace at first because it seemed like a really egregious assumption. And a lot of that was simply the fact I was anxious that I was injecting some of my own memories into this. But that's exactly what it was. I'm the visual storyteller here, and if I have memories to inject into a reader's sensory experience of this, it's my duty to do so. I guess the most obvious moment was, I remember very clearly reading for the first time Andrew's script as the Freedom Rides make their way to Montgomery, Alabama. And I remember Andrew's description of like about 5 miles north of Montgomery, the bus coming over this very low rise of a hill with planes and helicopters overhead and Montgomery in the background. The second I read this, I was like, that's actually a specific hill that I know from my life. Because I used to, my family would drive up through Birmingham to northern Mississippi to visit family. And about 5 miles north of Montgomery, I remember distinctly as a 5 or 6 year old, my mom pointing out that this was where the tiniest foothills of the Appalachian Mountains began, and that there was a specific rise that is the first of the tiniest foothills. And I was like, whoa. And so that was one of these moments where I'm like, this splash page here isn't just a composite of information and a guess based on what something would look like. This is my actual visual memory, minus the buses, police cars, and airplanes, but this is my visual account of that hill as I would have experienced it just 20 years later. There are also moments, particularly as we, in particular, as Andrew and as Lee, our editor, are working double time to kind of buttress up our objective historical account with the guidelines necessary to make sure that these books remain in classes as history and make the books as bulletproof as possible. There were these moments which were simply too strange for fiction. In book 2, one of the things that we will get kind of ill-informed pushback about, people get huffy and personal about it, is how bizarre it is that not once, but twice in this book, there are 2 separate stained glass windows from 2 separate churches who suffer attacks, one through a bomb and one through a brick thrown through the window, in which the face of Jesus is blown out of the window. In fact, the back cover of March Book 2 is a close-up of the blown out stained glass window from the bottom floor of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And a lot of people, not a lot, but I'm saying, like, those who feel inclined to make a stink about it in an Amazon review or talk about it to other like-minded people feel that this would be a sacrilegious image, and that it was a deliberate choice that uses artistic license for whatever nefarious purposes. But one reason why we recognized that we had to lean into this was the fact that, we've looked at the photos. This is in fact my rendition of the actual stained glass window with the exact shape blown out of Jesus's face. And this is actually the only stained glass window which was otherwise intact. Every other stained glass window was completely shattered. And so these were the moments where, like, we recognize this has symbolic value. We recognize that this works on multiple levels throughout the book. But this is the kind of thing that an editor, if you're doing fiction, they would have thrown this out of your story because it just seems too on the nose. And that's why, as nonfiction, we should dare to have the audacity to include this front and center. And it's one of those moments where perhaps it pisses the right people off and provides enough conversation that allows us to keep ironing in that balance between objective historical content balanced with John Lewis's subjective memories. We focus a lot on cowardice and hesitation, whether it's watching the Birmingham fire chief bow to the out of bounds authoritarian push from from Bull Connor in Birmingham, who's ordering the fire department to turn hoses on hundreds of activist children, which is not in any way in Bull Connor's authority, but watching moments of hesitation where he chooses to give in to that pressure instead of hold the line. Cowardice from John F. Kennedy himself throughout his relationship to the civil rights movement, him brushing off a lot of concerns, him waiting for there to be enough public pressure to make it seem worth it to him, but also cowardice in moments from moments of hesitation from Dr. King, from James Farmer, a lot of that having to do with difficult personal decisions they had to make, particularly on the freedom rides, with their own level of risk they were willing to take at that moment, and balancing those considerations with other responsibilities they had within the movement. And that's a lot of what helps cut back, push back against what Andrew was referring to as this tale of gods and kings, this hierarchical, centralized, top-down view of the civil rights struggle. So I guess, I've been running my mouth for a bit, so I'm just going to open things up a little here so we can talk, so we can get some questions. I'll bounce it back to you, Andrew, or whoever wants to take questions.
Yeah, I think we're going to take some questions right now.
Sure thing. We have some questions for you submitted by students in advance, but students are also welcome, anyone on the Zoom today, to submit questions in the Q&A if they can. So many questions, but I narrowed it down to just a few. A couple students are asking the decisions when you decided to use dark versus light. They noticed that March book 2, many of those illustrations are very dark. And they want to kind of understand a little bit of the creative process behind those choices that were made.
Well, a lot of, I guess, especially through, I did 3 full-length graphic novels before March book 1, and my 2 solo books, which were strictly in black and white line art. These 2 books are where I worked out a lot of my own visual lexicon in terms of using the negative space in comics basically as an often untapped visual communication tool. So to me, there's an obvious mood component, and I just love using black ink. But in terms of storytelling, to me, it just seemed very obvious that not only for scene shifts, but this is my book, Any Empire, recognizing that there are these moments where you're able to shift from black to white gutter space to note differences between past and present, between internal and external perspectives in storytelling, obvious stuff like day and night, inside and outside. But these are moments in which it seemed very plain to me that you don't always have to spell something out so explicitly. You don't have to use a caption which sets up a transition in time or a transition from internal or external perspectives. If you're able to do something wordlessly or simply imply by establishing that there's always a shift happening, when I'm moving between white and black negative space on a page, or if I'm cutting out panel borders completely and making a panel just a vignette without a border, that is meaningful. And it's not 100% tied to whatever my system of rules is, but I always feel like it's an interesting, engaging way to show a lot of the shifts, especially when throughout March, we're covering this large span of time, and especially in book 2, we're bouncing back and forth between John Lewis. Finally, the movement's getting big enough that he's not able to be there on the ground for everything. So we're able to use that negative space to show these shifts in his own presence, his own perspective, etc.
That's great.
There's also the element for the character, when we would try and highlight a character, we could do these profiles that by putting it in the negative space, with the black background, you could also show that here, we need to take a minute. We're going to give you an intro of this character. They're important. Here's their background. Okay, next page isn't reliefed. And then you're back in the moment, right? So it's there's a film equivalent of this, right? They'll do the aside where it's like, hey, wait, you need to know about this person. And so it's also the comic book way of doing that.
Terrific. I guess as a follow-up to that, we do have one question about why black and white and not color. Was there the decision process behind that?
There were three basic reasons. First off, even though tons of comics are in color, as far as like independent graphic novels go, still about half of them are in black and white or in gray, or use a very limited color palette. And that's still considered, like, whether or not this has any meaning, it's still considered kind of the gold standard of indie comics. So at the time we started March, I was strictly operating in a black and white world. I've expanded and kind of evolved to using a lot more color now, but that was sort of my go-to. The second reason was very practical. We recognized early on that regardless of other considerations, doing the book in color would take about twice as long for me at the drawing table, and there wouldn't be a measurable narrative benefit to depicting in color. And the third reason really is, like, for Generation X and for millennials, for anyone born after in the 70s or later, our relationship to this history, like it or not, is largely centered around grainy black and white footage and photos. And at first I kind of resisted that until I recognized that the way to humanize and revitalize that is by leaning in and embracing the black and white.
Terrific. We have another question here about, feel free, either of you. Why do you think young people are so important to so many protest movements, BLM, Arab Spring, gun control, etc.?
Yeah, I think young people are so important because they're the most free. I think we have seen a systematic effort over the last 40 to 50 years to try and reduce that freedom among young people, right? If you look at what happened in response to the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, they redesigned college campuses so that it was harder to protest, it's harder to gather. You couldn't occupy the buildings like they used to, right? And then 1971, they passed the 26th Amendment, thinking that by giving 18-year-olds the right to vote, they'll mollify them. And to a large extent, they did, right? But then they come in behind that with the invention of student loans and the escalating price of higher education. And that was something we always talked about with Congressman Lewis, is that imagine what it would have been like if the civil rights movement leaders had graduated from college with student loan debt. John Lewis was paid $10 a week as chairman of SNCC. They never could have done what they did if they'd had to endure the burden of student loan debt. We would always say we have to lift that burden of debt so that another generation is free to save us, essentially. And so it really seems like there's been a systematic effort to oppress these young people, keep them under control. And a lot of that has to do with, look at John Lewis. You look at us. I don't think Nate and I could make these books if we were any older than we were when we started. I was 23 when we started working on March. You have so much energy. You have so much courage, rightly or wrongly, so much freedom. And I think when you look back on it, all too often it is that courage, that freedom, that righteous indignation, that sense of being maladjusted to the status quo that John Lewis would talk about so often, is so important to being able to successfully lead a movement as a young person.
And also springboarding off that, not just being burdened by student loan debt, which results in people choosing to take fewer risks, because if you wind up in jail, you're not going to be able to work enough to pay off that monthly student loan payment or that car payment, and the way that all of that adds up and results in the rationalized decision to play it safer. I'm guilty of that. But let's talk about jail. Let's talk about the fact that, I'm somebody who I've tried to lean into the phrase showing up here in my community as a member of the protest community. But there's a difference, and I try to encourage people that it's not this binary thing where either you're like a super hardcore activist or you're completely complacent. It's important to recognize that a ton of people, maybe even most, need to embrace the fact that they show up. But in terms of sheer activism, the fact that, like, I've got 2 kids, if at all possible, I'm not going to jail. And I recognize that makes me lame in some ways, but I also recognize that I'm 44 years old. And so when I was 24 or 22 or 20, you bet I don't care if I'm going to jail. A lot of my friends went to jail in the 90s and the early 2000s through a lot of different movements. And it was just no thing. You'd get detained. You'd wind up like slipping in the prison porta potty or whatever. And US Marshals would let you out of an obscure parking garage in Washington, D.C. into the harsh sunlight or whatever. But recognizing that, yes, people who have fewer immediate considerations, like getting taken away from their kids for an indefinite period of time and locked up, results in people being more willing to take more risks that result in jail time and legal entanglement. And without the presence of young people in mass being willing to go to jail, the civil rights movement simply would not have been successful in the same way.
Thank you so much for that insight. We have 2 more questions about the book process. The March Book 2 ends with the bombing of the church in Birmingham. Why did you choose to end the book that way?
I think part of our challenge was to, like I said earlier, to try and put the events together in an organized way so that you would see these moments that we already recognized in a different context. You would see a fuller context. And when you look at the March on Washington, we take it for granted that this was successful. There's something called the 9-word problem, right? Most students graduated from high school only knowing 9 words about the movement before March. Those 9 words were, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and I Have a Dream. And when we look at the March on Washington as this isolated event, we lose all sense of its significance, how it was strategically important, what it actually accomplished, and also what it provoked. Because like I said earlier, the freedom rides are what made, in many ways, the March on Washington possible. We forget about the lessons of or the fear that gripped white Washington before the march, right? The comments by President Kennedy where he says, will there be violence, chaos, and disorder in the streets? And then the ultimate payoff joke from Bayard Rustin, who said in an interview later that it was the most meaningful moment of his life when he comes in after the March on Washington, sees Abe Philip Randolph crying in front of the March on Washington sign in the main office, and Bayard makes a joke out of it. And he says, "There's no trash in D.C.," all this sort of stuff. But you can't leave it there. Especially in a trilogy, you need to understand this next chapter, what leads to the violence and the insistence of the Mississippi Freedom Summer and the push towards the right to vote and all that happened around it. We look at the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in isolation. But when you pair it and you realize that it was only a few weeks after the March on Washington, you understand that the reaction to the March on Washington wasn't the universal adulation that we were all too often taught. You realize that it provoked violence, that it provoked, that in fact, the violence, chaos, and disorder that President Kennedy was afraid of when he first heard about the March on Washington wasn't from the activists and the people of color coming to Washington, but it was from the backlash of the white supremacists who were watching their way of life erode and who were so angry they were willing to kill, even in a church, even little girls. And so that's why it was so important that we had that scene at the end, because it's the only way you can adequately punctuate the history that was really unfolding and not give a false sense of idolatry or historiography, to use the right word, about the March on Washington.
With the end of all 3 of the books, for each of the 3 books, we felt that it would be a fatal error to replicate the common misconception of civil rights movement history as being a constant straight line that is now lining up with this improved, moral arc of the universe bending towards justice by itself. And so whether it's the last 4 pages of March Book 1, recognizing physical confrontation looming in the direct wake of the desegregation decision, we knew that we could not undercut the significance of that immediate backlash, and I feel like the most potent example is at the end of book 3, coming straight from within hours of the series of victorious speeches on the Alabama State Capitol steps, including the "no lie can live forever" moment from Dr. King, directly being followed a few hours later by the murder of a crucial organizer within Alabama, driving activists back and forth to home directly after the speeches. We would not be doing a service to any of us or to our understanding of the movement if we present these victories as unadulterated victories. In fact, I think that's the crucial error of my parents' generation of well-intended white Southerners teaching me this history, is trying to recognize or trying to see how much energy was put into presenting victories as neat, final, decisive victories instead of part of an ongoing movement of which we are all still hopefully a part.
Thank you so much. Very powerful. And then perhaps the final question, personal interest question. What was it like working with John Lewis? Which one of you go first?
Go for it, Andrew.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it was like John Lewis and I were, we were just together constantly for a decade. And we worked on these books. We worked in Congress. I was also his digital director and policy advisor. So we were working on legislation, like any of the tweets you ever saw. I did all the tweeting. Like that's where Good Trouble came from, right? So much of my world, he became like a father to me, and he would say I was like a son to him. So much of my world was about making John Lewis happy, like helping him work, helping his work, helping advance his mission, but also like these little things that people don't think about. I mean, I know where to get a blueberry muffin anywhere in New York City in the event that we were in New York City and he wanted breakfast because that was his favorite. He was such a kind man, but also such a troublemaker. I mean, there would be so much drama in a lot of his, like he just loved to stir up things, like he loved for there to be drama. And at the same time, he would play jokes on us, like in the office. If he wanted attention, he would come in, he would grab some of these little prepackaged bags of jelly beans that we had at the front desk for visitors, and he would throw them up in the air and they would come down on your desk. So you'd just be sitting there typing and all of a sudden jelly beans was raining down on you. You're like, yes, sir. Like you knew what was happening. And then the late night phone calls. I mean, it was almost strange. After he passed, it was so strange to me to not be getting phone calls at 10 or 11 o'clock at night with him. I saw this on the news. We should be doing something about that. Like it was, it was extraordinarily rewarding and difficult and challenging and everything you would think of to try and keep up and help and also and sometimes even lead a man like that. And when it came to the books, so much of what I enjoyed about the making of the books was how much joy it gave him. We were on the New York Times bestseller list for years. And every Friday he would call from wherever he was in the world if we weren't together. And if we were together, he would sneak out and be like, do you have any good news for me? And he wanted to know, was he still on the bestseller list? Because he got so much joy from it. It was like this vindication after so many years. I think that's the thing. We forget that the John Lewis that I first met in 2007 and started working for is not the John Lewis that we celebrate today. That he went through this very dark period in his life of obscurity. He was respected in the Congress, but people did not know who he was. He would get recognized, but not like he used to, not like he did before he passed. And I think for me, especially after his wife died, when he felt so alone, I felt like it was my job to help, just to help him survive and help him receive everything he deserved in his lifetime. Because I think far too often we don't celebrate people like him while they're alive. We only do it after they pass. And I'm just so glad that he got to see all of that. I'm so glad we got to have this journey. Nate can tell you, I had the unenviable task of perpetually following John Lewis on stage whenever we gave speeches. So I do my best. I get up there and I say, how do you follow that? It's John Lewis. Like, what do you want me to do? I'm the aide. I wrote the comic. Hi, and it was just a very intense period of time in my life. And working with him, you never knew what the next day was going to be like. You really never knew. It could be one day you're loaning him money to get bailed out because he forgot his bail money because he got arrested. The next day you're in the office, Steve Van Zandt comes in and he wants to talk to you about comics. Or then Jim Lawson comes in. Or then you're having a sit-in on the gun control on the House floor, and all of a sudden I'm having to put together this whole strategy for social media. It was just, you never knew what it was. And you were just always trying to keep up with this man with unbelievable energy.
For me, yeah, a lot of it had to do with kind of like catching up with where Andrew had been over the past several years of his life with Congressman Lewis. And basically, I remember on that very first day where I met the congressman, just walking from the House building over to the US Capitol to do that walk around and getting stopped about every 25 feet, which I quickly learned happens every second of every day. But I was like, what's going on here? And just like reading the emotions just oozing from people as they got to meet this actual hero. And I remember Andrew on day one just being like, get used to it, man. Take it all in, recognize this is what life's going to be like for the next while. And so, yeah, we'd be in these weird moments where like, as our society began in real time throughout doing these March books, began shifting hard to the right into this reactionary, authoritarian, white supremacist swing. Only towards the end there did we notably have an increase in like security at some of our events. But early on, Congressman Lewis was still kind of very much of the opinion that he would refuse extra security in most occasions. And so there were a lot of moments throughout our time together where another side of the job was recognizing like, okay, if we're going to get through this crowd to go eat lunch or to go to like our talk or like do whatever needs to be done, most of the time, Andrew and I were suited up. And so basically, Andrew was like, look, man, I hate to say this, but you're going to have to learn how to pretend like you're a bodyguard. Nobody knows who we are. Nobody cares. So basically be like, get big and think you're a bodyguard. And basically you just like, I do the like fake Secret Service thing where you like walk around and you're like, oh, excuse me, with like sunglasses. And you're like, what a weird part of my life that my scrawny comic book nerd self has to convince people that I'm a bodyguard for this congressman, and that without that, like we would have been screwed in so many logistical points throughout our day. And I'm like, all right, just a weird skill set I have to learn to roll with. Yeah, those are the things that can never be anticipated in our day-to-day lives together until those moments where you're like, okay, this is about to get real weird again.
Thank you so much for all of that. These stories to treasure. So this concludes our talk with you both. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the insight you've given us today. We're definitely grateful for our time together, for your creativity and devotion. Has us thinking and rethinking the history and ongoing struggle with civil rights. So thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
Yep.